So I want to take you through a sample turn of the game to show you the variety of things that can happen and to bring everything together. So the board is set up for play. All of the states have their state seals and initial support. The issues are on their starting positions with defense in position 1, economy in position 2, and civil rights in position 3. Then seed the political capital bag with 10 cubes for Nixon and 10 cubes for Kennedy. The candidate tokens are placed in their home states, Nixon in California and Kennedy in Massachusetts. So each player will decide which candidate they're playing as and take the appropriate candidate card, state support cube supply, and 2 momentum markers. I'll take you through turn 1 of the game, showing you the 5 phases, momentum, and campaign strategy and rest phases. The first thing we do in turn 1 is the initiative phase. The first thing that happens in the initiative phase is each player gets a new hand of 6 cards. Then we do an initiative check to see who's going to go first in this turn. So we draw 2 cubes from the political capital bag. It's 1 for each, so we need to draw 1 more cube. And it's a blue, so Kennedy gets to decide who goes first during this turn. Kennedy decides to have Nixon go first for this turn. So now we're ready to begin turn 1, phase 1. Nixon goes first and plays Heartland of America for the 3 campaign points, and using the positioning on issues action to get 2 cubes of support in defense. Remember that the second cube played to the same issue within the same phase costs 2 points. Nixon also gains 1 rest cube, which he places into his coffee mug. Now it's Kennedy's turn. Kennedy plays Nixon's pledge for the event. For the remainder of the turn, the Kennedy player gains 1 momentum marker whenever the Nixon player plays a card as anything other than a campaigning action. Kennedy doesn't get any rest cubes. On to phase 2. Nixon plays New England for 3 campaign points to campaign in California. So Nixon puts 3 state support cubes in California and also gains 1 rest cube. The Kennedy player decides to spend 1 momentum marker to trigger the event on this card that Nixon played. So the Kennedy player can add a total of 5 state support in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont, no more than 2 per state. So the Kennedy player places 2 state support cubes in New York and 2 state support cubes in Massachusetts. At this point, the Kennedy player carries the state of Massachusetts because he has at least 4 cubes there. And he puts 1 more cube of state support in Connecticut. Now it's Kennedy's turn to play a card. Kennedy plays the Nixon's knee card for the event. Immediately move the Nixon candidate marker to Maryland without paying the normal travel costs. And for the remainder of the turn, the Nixon player must expend 1 momentum marker in order to play a card as a campaigning action. The Kennedy player doesn't gain any rest cubes. On to phase 3. Nixon plays the Southern Revolt card for the 3 campaign points in the advertising action. So Nixon gets to draw from the political capital bag 3 cubes. Nixon only gets to place the cubes drawn of his color, so he gets to place 1 cube of advertising support in any region. Nixon decides to place it in the East. Nixon also gets 1 rest cube. Since Nixon didn't play the points for a campaigning action, Kennedy gets 1 momentum marker from the Nixon's pledge event played earlier. Kennedy plays the Harry F. Byrd card for 2 campaigning points to campaign in New York. He decides to use the 2 campaign points to add 2 state support in New York. Kennedy now carries the state of New York. Since this is the only state he campaigned in, he moves his candidate marker to New York. Kennedy also gets 2 rest cubes. Nixon decides to spend 1 momentum marker to trigger the event on the card. So Nixon can remove the 2 Kennedy state support cubes in Mississippi and 1 in Alabama. On to phase 4. Nixon plays the gaff card for the event, which causes the Kennedy player to lose a momentum marker, as well as 3 state support in New York where his candidate token is. Kennedy no longer carries New York, but he still leads it. Nixon's decision not to perform a campaigning action, however, gives Kennedy a momentum marker due to the Nixon's Pledge card event played earlier. Kennedy plays the Gathering Momentum in the West card for the 4 campaign points to add 3 cubes of state support back to New York, so Kennedy once again carries the state of New York, and he has the 4th cube of state support in Pennsylvania. Now Kennedy could either keep his candidate token in New York or move it to Pennsylvania by changing the order in which he visits the states. He decides to end up in Pennsylvania and so moves his candidate token there. Nixon decides to pay 1 momentum marker to trigger this event since he currently leads more states in the West than Kennedy. So he gains the momentum marker back, plus 1 state support in each western state currently having no support for either candidate. This would include Alaska and Hawaii. On to Phase 5. Nixon plays the Harvard Brain Trust card for the 4 campaign points that he wants to use to spend on campaigning in the states. But before he does that, he has to pay a momentum marker due to the Nixon's Knee event card played earlier. Nixon decides first to campaign in New York. Normally Nixon would be required to do support checks in New York because Kennedy carries the state of New York because he has at least 4 state support cubes there. However, Nixon has a support cube in advertising in the East, so Nixon is exempt from doing support checks in the East. So Nixon can use 2 of those 4 campaign points to remove 2 cubes of state support from Kennedy in New York. Kennedy now no longer carries the state of New York, but still leads there. Nixon decides to spend the remaining 2 campaign points campaigning in Pennsylvania. Again, normally Nixon would have to do support checks because the Kennedy candidate token is in Pennsylvania. However, the support cube of advertising in the East for Nixon also exempts him from having to do support checks with the candidate token. So Nixon can use the 2 campaign points, one to remove the Kennedy cube that's there, and the other one to add a state support cube of his own in Pennsylvania. Now Nixon campaigned both in New York and Pennsylvania, so Nixon can move his candidate token to either one of these states just by changing the order in which he campaigned. Nixon decides to join Kennedy in Pennsylvania. Kennedy notices that the event on this card is going to help him during the debates. So Kennedy decides to pay 1 momentum marker to activate the event on the card that Nixon played. So Kennedy places the card up in the persistent events section at the top of the map board in the debate events section, and this card will be brought back into the game during the special debates turn to help Kennedy out in the debates. Kennedy plays the Puerto Rican Bishop's card for the 3 campaign points to position on the issues. Kennedy is going to decide to put 1 campaign point in each issue, so he removes 1 of Nixon's cubes in defense and gets 1 of his own support in economy and civil rights. Kennedy also gains 1 rest cube. On to the momentum phase. So at the start of the momentum phase, each player has to discard half of their momentum markers rounded down. Nixon has no momentum markers to lose. Kennedy only has 1, so half of 1 is a half, rounded down as 0, so Kennedy gets to hold on to that 1 momentum marker. The next thing that happens is that the players receive awards for their support on the issues. Kennedy has support on the 3rd place issue, civil rights, so Kennedy gains a momentum marker. Kennedy also has support in the 2nd place issue, so Kennedy can either get another momentum marker or an endorsement. Kennedy decides to draw an endorsement card, and Kennedy gets an endorsement in the South. So Kennedy can place an endorsement marker in the South. Nixon has support on the 1st place issue, defense, so Nixon gains a momentum marker as well as an endorsement. Nixon draws a card from the endorsements deck and gains a major endorsement. This means that Nixon can place an endorsement marker in any region on the board. Nixon decides to do this in the South and removes the Kennedy endorsement marker in the South. Now each issue loses one support cube, so all of these support cubes will come off. Finally, because Nixon leads in advertising across the board with this advertising support cube in the East, Nixon has the option to switch two of the issues on the issues track. Nixon decides to do this and switches defense and economy, boosting the economy's issue on the issues track to priority 1. On to campaign strategy and rest phase. Both players now play their sole remaining card to their campaign strategy decks and deposit the cubes they've accumulated as rest into the political capital bag. So that does it for turn 1. You reset the phase track to 1, move the turn track up to 2, and repeat the phases for turns 2, 3, 4, and 5. Have the special debates turn, repeat the phases for turns 7 and 8, and then move into election day to see who won.